Nebraska Act. The Compromise of 1850 is going to create a great deal of resentment among the abolitionists. They're going to view this as them losing their freedom, that the North is losing its liberty at the hands of this compromise, right? All to make the Southerners happy. That these Southerners, it's kind of like the tail wagging the dog, if you will. That the drive to keep these Southerners happy with their little peculiar institution. And you've got people that are increasingly critical of the slave system, the slave labor system, the cotton economy, the credit, the fact that, really not very many people are benefiting from this, slave system. It's only a very small group that it's very difficult to move up. It really kind of limits individualism in a lot of ways. But now that we have all this territory, you've got Kansas that wants to come in, as well as Nebraska that want to come in as states. But are they going to be slave states or free states? And again, this debate about slavery on the heels of the Compromise of 1850, no one can decide exactly what we need to do. So Stephen Douglas, who wants to be sure and have a path for Kansas and Nebraska to get to become territories and become states, he wants to push for this transcontinental railroad to go through Chicago. And he wants the territory west of Illinois to be organized so there's a justification for the railroad to go through Chicago. So he comes up with the idea of popular sovereignty. We'll just let the states decide. We'll let the local entity decide. There's no reason for Congress and the federal government to be involved. And what will happen is that the resulting bleeding Kansas, this, people shipping, their side in, the violence, the burning, the murders, those things are going to kind of alienate people. And so the Bleeding Kansas issue is going to turn people against Stephen Douglas and the Kansas-Nebraska Act and will ultimately harden divisions, create far more distrust than there was before. The Kansas-Nebraska Act and Bleeding Kansas will result in a great deal of propaganda talking about the violence and, on both sides. And so it's going to get even worse, because of Bleeding Kansas. So, prior to the 1856 election, you don't have a single strong national party. And you haven't really for about 10 years. There's not a strong national party. They're divided over what to do about slavery. They're divided about immigration. This is where the Know Nothing Party, that's very nativist, which is preference for native-born Americans, they're anti-Catholic, anti-Irish. They really kind of destroy the Whig Party. They siphon off enough votes. However, they will fail to deliver on the tight citizenship and naturalization laws, so they will fall out of favor pretty quickly, but they do have a brief moment where they're kind of popular. The Republican Party also gets formed. This is a hybrid party of free soilers who want there to not be slavery, know-nothings who aren't sure how they feel about immigrants, and Whigs who are very much market economy. So the result is going to be a platform of the Republican Party that is clearly anti-slavery. That does not mean that they're abolitionists, but it does mean they want to stop the spread of slavery to allow for independent farmers to move west. So this is going to be pro-homesteading. It's going to be pro-market economy, homesteading. Like we want white settlers to move out west and settle with farms, and anti-popular sovereignty. And that's a big deal. That they don't want that kind of violence. The Republican Party is going to be a regional party, primarily in the North, with a little bit of support in California. In fact, they will nominate John C. Fremont from California as their candidate for 1856. They'll campaign heavily on a Southern power conspiracy that the Southerners are dominated by a handful of wealthy planters that want to control everything, that want kind of an aristocratic system, if you will. They also campaign that they promote freedom, that they're not, they don't support the Compromise of 1850. They're, in favor of the market economy and free white labor. and all those kinds of things. Now, the Democrats will nominate James Buchanan, a Northerner with very strong Southern sympathies, very friendly with Southerners. And Buchanan and the Democrats will get very, very scared because the Republicans have this really strong showing in 1856. Not enough to win, but enough to scare the Democrats into believing that an anti-slavery power was striving to gain control in Washington, D.C. And so that is a big fear in the South. Then you're going to see the Dred Scott decision in 1857, where the Supreme Court says that the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional, that you should be able to take your slaves wherever you want to. And then that's going to be followed by the Harper's Ferry and John Brown, who essentially kind of launches this, attempt at raising a revolution or getting a resistance of of African Americans. And of course, he gets captured and all that kind of stuff. But for Southerners, this is going to be proof that abolitionist rhetoric has gone too far. That how could people praise John Brown like he's some kind of martyr, right? We still debate today whether or not he's a martyr. That's something we'll be looking at in class. Should we trust him? Should we be glad that he tried this thing in Harper's Ferry, or should we blame him for essentially setting us up towards the Civil War? But all of this, the Harper's Ferry wouldn't have happened without the Dred Scott decision, so you can't take Harper's Ferry out of context. It's definitely the result of the Dred Scott decision. It's definitely a result of the Compromise of 1850, and really kind of this dysfunctional political environment that we're looking at. The election of 1860 is going to see the Democratic Party split. Stephen Douglas, who had been the designer of popular sovereignty, rejects the Lecompton Constitution that the pro-slavery Kansas had sent, and he, that kind of damages his credibility, if you will. And so you're going to see that Stephen Douglas is going to be rejected by Southern Democrats, only embraced by Northern Democrats. Southern Democrats are going to nominate John C. Breckinridge as the president. Abraham Lincoln will get the Republican nomination, which actually takes him a while. It's kind of an interesting story about how much finagling they have to do in order to get him the Republican nomination. And then John Bell of the Constitutional Party. Let's just pretend nothing's happening. We're just going to keep going. And you really have with these four candidates this attitude that there is no good solution left, that they've exhausted their ability to avoid discussing slavery at all. And that's going to kind of create an issue. The election of 1860 is regional, not national. Remember, Lincoln's not on any of the Southern ballots because the Republicans were so clearly anti-slavery. So in the North, it's going to be primarily Douglas versus Lincoln. And of course, Lincoln will campaign on the promise of the Homestead Act. We're going to find a way to give you acreage if you're willing to develop the land. In the South, it's Breckinridge versus Bell, with Lincoln not even on the Southern ballots. Lincoln will ultimately win because he has the Electoral College votes, because he carries the most populous states. He does not win a single Southern state, and the South is going to feel that the election of 1860 is further proof that they have lost their grip on national politics, that over time that the power structure is going to change and they're going to begin to lose their influence. So Lincoln's election is going to convince the South that their way of life was at risk, that slavery and the use of slaves as a labor supply. So in December of 1860, South Carolina repeals the ratification of the Constitution, followed by other states, right? All of these states from the lower South. Your border states, the ones like Maryland, Virginia, for instance, they struggle with this decision because they're not sure that they really want to go that far. Remember, West Virginia is created in part because that's a part of Virginia that did not want to raise arms against the country. So you have a real question about the secession here. You do have some attempts to compromise. The Crittenden Compromise wanted to extend the Missouri Compromise all the way to the Pacific, except, of course, Dred Scott has already made that basically unconstitutional. And a lot of reassurance from Lincoln. I'm really, I'm not that bad of a guy. I don't want you to leave the Union. We'll try to figure it out, all that kind of stuff. And he basically, says, look, I'm just doing what's in my job description, right? I'm allowed, we're allowed to not have to return people slaves and all that kind of stuff. Or I'm sorry, not return people slaves, but to stop slavery and that kind of thing. So Lincoln is working very hard to try to fix that and try to put forth this idea that the Union of the United States is perpetual, that the states can't decide to leave. That's a misapplication of the law. However, because he's talking and he's very clear about this, he's not going to allow slavery to expand to the western states. These territories that are going to be settled will not have slavery. The whole point of this western expansion in the possible Homestead Act is so that free white labor can have a chance to farm. And free white farmers cannot possibly compete with a plantation owner that has all this cheap labor. That's just not going to happen. So he doesn't, his basis for his thinking is not out of some great sense of equality, but it's very kind of practical and pragmatic. Has a whole lot to do with individualism for whites, except, of course, the South doesn't see it that way. South Carolina has seceded. They basically have Fort Sumter in Charleston surrounded. Fort Sumter begins to run out of food. And, of course, now keep in mind Jefferson Davis is now the president of the Confederacy. They're developing their own government systems. Lincoln goes ahead and says, you know what, we're going to resupply Fort Sumter. Jefferson Davis says, oh, how dare he send ships into the harbor? By golly, we're going to, do something. And so they fire on Fort Sumter. This will cause Lincoln to call up the volunteers. Again, is this rebellion? To me, it clearly is. People that are very much slavery apologists maybe see it a little bit differently. But Lincoln definitely calls up the volunteers. And I think that it's just very important for you to kind of grasp the impact of secession. Really, once the Missouri Compromise is found to be unconstitutional, that the country is going to have to choose one side or the other. This, a house divided cannot stand mentality. This idea that we could have free states and slave states has been done away with thanks to Dred Scott. And really all your previous discussions about secession, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, the Hartford Convention, the Exposition and Protest, are really not widely accepted. They are, most people see the Union as perpetual until you get to the election of 1860. Now, what's going to be important here is that for the Southerners, it's all about the election of Lincoln, that somehow the election of Lincoln was the event that changed everything for them, which, I would kind of argue with. But I do think that it's telling to recognize that that's what they thought. And I also think it's telling to recognize, the different steps that kind of lead us into the Civil War and how all of this works. So hopefully this kind of helped put some of this in context for you. The documents we'll be looking at in class should help you as well. And so we will be moving from here into the